Okay, so I am so excited to introduce you a new format of the podcast. I am actually going to be speaking with my new incredible superstar of a doctor, Dr. Sara Szal Gottfried. She is absolute pioneer in women's health, has a ton of incredible books on perimenopause, menopause, and women's health topics in general. And we're really deciding to collaborate or bring this duo to life because we want to do a few things. We want to review some of my lab. She's going to, of course, be giving her medical opinion and her expertise. She's going to be helping me to improve my protocol. It's super important for me as a woman serving women to also have an incredible female doctor. And that is definitely where Sara comes in. She is so incredible and experienced. So, one aspect of what we'll be doing is talking about my labs and protocol. We'll be discussing things that are going really well, things that are not going so well. There is life, so I do have shifts, and I'm so excited to review what I'm doing to improve any areas that need improvement, maintain any other areas that are looking really good, and then we really just want to see what the boundaries are for women's health. What can you do? What's possible? And I'm so blessed to have access to a lot of these interesting therapies for us to run these trials and protocols. So this is going to be a podcast that will also be covering top trendy health topics. So headlines, things that could be confusing. We want to just make it simple and actionable. We'll also be reviewing the literature in depth. So if you have interesting studies that you're curious about and our clients to women's health, they send them our way. But this is going to be a podcast that is out on my platform, but also Dr. Szal Gottfried's platform. Her podcast is Treated, which is a free podcast if you haven't listened to it. So let's dive into it. I'm exploring all these longevity optimization protocols, right? They can be a little bit intense sometimes. They can be a little bit crazy. But I'm really committed to seeing what's possible with my body, right? We know there's a lot of men out there with these insane protocols. They're spending tons and tons of money, but we know that women's bodies are different and we didn't really have a blueprint. So I think that we're trying to achieve a few goals here. Number one, look at the protocol I'm doing now, see what's working, see what's not, see what happens during different life cycles too, changes in my body or my environment. And, Dr. Saul is going to be able to give us all of her expert opinion on labs. We're going to talk about what labs to do, maybe why, things to consider. But I'm just so excited to have someone so special in the space come on and join forces with me and, be my doctor now. And we're going to just get all the data. And there's also it's such a confusing time for women's health because not only do we not have a lot of data on ourselves, right? It's the literature is just so sparse for women, but we also are just continually being bombarded with headlines like this week, and we're going to touch on this later. That
Microplastics?
wax will, oh my gosh, it's almost like, do we just give up? No, of course not. But it's wild. I'm sure everyone listening has seen the headline of microplastics in glass actually being more in some cases than in plastic water bottles. So we want to look at my protocols, what I'm doing, what's working, what's not, where can we improve, data points for you to look at home, and then also address some of these headlines, dive deep into the research, and see what it really says for women, because we know that it can be a very confusing landscape to navigate. So that's why I'm so excited about this. And what about you?
I'm so excited to be in conversation. I feel like you are leading the charge with female longevity. So I don't have to explain that to your listeners or to my listeners. We've talked about this before on my podcast. And I feel like, what I've seen over the past 30 years of my career is that it's a health hazard to be female. Why is it a health
Yeah.
hazard? It's a health hazard because there are so many gaps, research gaps, clinical gaps, protocol gaps, guideline gaps, and it has led to the current state, which is where women have double the risk of anxiety, depression, insomnia, Alzheimer's disease. We've got 4 times the rate of autoimmune disease. There's so many ways in which women are falling behind men, and I don't see enough research dollars or commitment on behalf of the government to address these gaps. Women still die of the number one killer of cardiovascular disease at much higher rates than men do. So even though that's less relevant for younger listeners, millennials and younger, I think that you're leading the charge to close these gaps. And what I've especially seen, because you and I are a different generation, which I think is super fun. So you're a millennial, I'm Gen X. And we know that it's millennials that are saying enough. Like, I refuse to be dismissed. I refuse to be told by a broken healthcare system that I should just do what men do to help my longevity. So it's millennials that are standing up and saying, we need medicine 3.0. And I feel like you're leading the charge to help us get there. So that gets me super excited. Whether we're talking about microplastics, what we know, what we don't know, or we're talking about your latest toxic burden, the effect of the LA fires, whether we're talking about your hormones, which is the portal that I usually like to walk through, whether we're talking about fertility and subfertility and ways to affect your mitochondria. So we've got a lot to talk about. And that's what gets me excited.
I love that. Actually, before we jump into it, you shared something yesterday. I think it was from Forbes Women, and it showed the percentage of women that are being medically gaslit, I believe was the terminology. So you can define what that means, but it was an insanely high percentage. Was it something? It was over 70%, right?
I believe it was 72% in this article that was quoted. So, I always hear people kind of push back when I talk about medical gaslighting. But there's a way that women are dismissed, and our symptoms, our legitimate symptoms are, like when I was in my 30s, when I was about your age, Kayla, I went to my doctor when I was postpartum, and I said, listen, I feel way too old at 34. Like, this doesn't seem normal. I feel like I'm pushing a rock up the hill every day. I'm exhausted. Getting 8 hours of sleep doesn't seem to make a difference. I'm cranky. I'm irritable. It's not just PMS, it's worse. I feel so stressed all the time, and I just can't calm my system down. And what I was offered, I also was struggling with weight, which is maybe different between the two of us. But you know what my primary care doctor said, a guy, was, you just need to exercise more and eat less. Why don't you take an antidepressant like Prozac? And how about a birth control pill? Because it sounds like you're hormonal. So that, to me, is a form of gaslighting. It's a way of saying, get out of my office. Here's a couple of prescriptions to mask your symptoms and be on your way. We're not going to get to the root of your issues. So to me, that's a form of saying what you're complaining about is not legitimate and it doesn't warrant a deeper investigation. There's other more official definitions, but that was my experience, and I think that's what a lot of women experience. If I was experiencing it and I'm a doctor, then that tells me there's millions of women that are going through this.
Absolutely. I've heard that just this one specific instance, that endometriosis for a woman that has endometriosis, it can take almost a decade to get a diagnosis for this.
That's right. So I would say some of the diagnoses that are delayed include endometriosis. And I've seen figures from 7 to 10 years of delay of diagnosis. And this is where women are told, okay, you've got painful periods. That's normal. I mean, if you want, you can take a birth control pill, but that's just part of being a woman. So that's an example of what women are told. But it's not just endometriosis, it's also polycystic ovary syndrome, which is often delayed by 7 to 10 years, similar to endometriosis. It's also perimenopause. It's also subfertility. So I don't believe that you have to wait until 35 to get your fertility investigated. I don't think you have to wait until you're trying in earnest for 6 to 12 months before you qualify for hormone testing. I think we need a different way of taking care of women. So that's what you and I are changing. We're changing the conversation about women's health and longevity.
I love that so much, and yeah, I'm excited. I'm so blessed that I'm in a bit of a different ecosystem here with how I receive care, right? Having access to you and other individuals. But, I had a call with my cousin who feels, as if something's going in the wrong direction. And she was explaining to me the process and how long it takes to get even to the right specialist that can even begin. I mean, we're talking years. And yeah, I'm really excited to be able to share information and resources with women so that, hopefully we can improve some of that. Last question on this topic is, why do you think it is so? This is just, conjecture, but why do we think women are medically gaslit seemingly so a lot more than men?
That's a big question. So I think there's a lot of reasons. I think there's, if we start first with the biological reasons, I would say number one, women tend to have more complexity than men, just from a biological perspective. So, some men might argue with that, but when you look at hormones as an example, men have really stable testosterone levels unless they're chronically stressed or eating too much sugar. For the most part, they've got stable testosterone levels, and then it starts to dwindle very gradually after age 40. Now, there's exceptions to that. There's a lot of men who have a problem with low T before that. But women have a different level of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone every day of their menstrual cycle. And that's part of the reason why women were excluded from research studies. So it leads to a level of complexity that I think a lot of physicians just sort of say, oh, that hormonal system, I'm just not even going to really sink my teeth into it and learn about it. I'm just going to focus on men and just assume the same thing applies to women. So there's this biological complexity that leads to more mysterious symptoms that change with the menstrual cycle, autoimmunity, diagnoses like Hashimoto's thyroiditis or multiple sclerosis or um, rheumatoid arthritis, some of the most common autoimmune diseases, happen 4 times as commonly in women, as I mentioned, but they also are delayed, similar to endometriosis and PCOS, by 4 to 7 years before a correct diagnosis is made. So there's this biological complexity. Our immune system is very different than the male immune system. There's then, so those are sex differences, but then, Kayla, there's also gender differences, which are socially constructed. And that includes a patriarchal system that doesn't listen carefully to women, that doesn't take our concerns as seriously as the concerns of men. And that's what I think millennials are changing. That's what gets me super excited. But it's led to a long history of labels like, this woman has hysteria. This woman is in perimenopause. We can't trust the symptoms that she's describing. Or this woman just had a baby. She's hormonal. She has got the blues. So, I mean, there's other things as well, economic differences, access differences, um, different pay rates and how that then maps to the kind of healthcare that you can afford. So I think those are some of the differences, but what I tend to focus on is not dwelling on what's wrong, but more what's the problem to solve? How do we solve it?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, because for example, if someone had the information, like here are the labs that I should test for Hashi, for example, I'm sure that you would be able to have that comprehensive lab panel and diagnose it on the first visit, right?
Totally. I look for it in every patient I see. It's so
Yeah.
common. I mean, it's so what we know from the panels, like the function health panels, done on a couple 100,000 people, healthy subjects mostly, is that about 12 to 13% have antibodies against their thyroid. It's so common that I think everyone should be tested.
Yeah, what is your level that you're looking for to be under? Is it, like, completely 0, or are you okay with, like, 5 or 9 of the TPO antibodies?
Yeah, so I'm looking at 2 different antibodies. I'm looking at thyroid peroxidase, which is TPO, as you mentioned. I'm also looking at antibodies, like, the antithyroglobulin antibodies. So I like to look at both for the best specificity. And this is an important point, I think, about optimal lab ranges versus normal lab ranges.
Yeah.
It's less about the absolute value, and it's more about the timeline. So what's happening over time? Are your antibodies increasing? Did you have an infection and your antibodies went up and then came back down because your lifestyle is so optimized? So I'm looking at a timeline, a time series. That's what I think is most important. But if I have a patient who's got elevated antibodies, maybe they're like 35 to 100 or up to 200, but the rest of her thyroid tests are relatively normal. Maybe she's got some stress, she's in her 30s. Her TSH is, say, 1.0, 1.5 in the normal range, the euthyroid range. In that situation, I'm going to try some lifestyle maneuvers. I'm going to work on cortisol. I'm going to work on the immune system and immunomodulators, things like black cumin. Black cumin seed has been shown to help with reversing autoimmune attack on the thyroid. I'm going to try things like looking at micronutrients and how those are supporting thyroid health. I'm going to run a genetic panel to look at DIO2. That's something I need to look at in your case. I'm going to look at, in terms of micronutrients, all the micronutrients related to thyroid health. So that's copper, zinc, selenium, not just your cortisol levels, which can modulate thyroid, but also your estrogen levels. I'm going to look at your, I'm going to tune into iodine levels because the therapeutic range for iodine is super tight, a lot tighter than most other micronutrients. And a lot of people are overdosing with supplements. So we want to look at this bigger picture, which is part of what I am so thrilled to be in conversation about with you.
Absolutely. Well, for anyone listening and taking some notes, I think you dropped some really valuable input on what to look for on your thyroid panel. And it's
Can I add
interesting
one more
because
thing? So this is what happens in perimenopause, Kayla. You forget one thing, and so you come up with the second best thing. So as I was pausing there, and I was like, "What was that other thing I was thinking of?" It's vitamin D. So vitamin D is such a critical immunomodulator, such a critical immunomodulator, and you basically can't heal leaky gut if your vitamin D is low. I like to see levels around 60 to 100, 60 to 90, and then the other factor, if I've got someone who's starting to change their thyroid function and they're sort of early in the process of looking like they're pre-Hashimoto's, I'll use low-dose naltrexone. And we should talk about that at some point, maybe not today.
yeah, I've been on LDN for 3 years, I wanna say. So, it's interesting because I've obviously been measuring my TPO antibodies for some time, and they've always been, undetectable. And then when I had an antibiotic round that really wiped out my gut, they started to increase. So I saw them creep up to about 12. And obviously, I immediately, looked at micronutrients, everything you're saying. I also did that TPE procedure. I can't say for sure that that's what it did, but it went from 12 back down to 0, not detectable. So it's just exciting that, we can see these things so early and then start taking action and make them go in a better direction.
That's right. So, what I love about the kind of care that you want is that you're on the front lines. You want proactive care. You don't want to wait until the antibodies are, you know, greater than 100 or at some particular level. You want to do what you can to help modulate your immune system. And what you just described, this sequence of taking antibiotics, your microbiome going through a change, and I've seen this too after taking antibiotics, and then detecting this difference in terms of the way your immune system is talking to your thyroid, and then trying some N-of-1 interventions like a total plasma exchange. That's proactive care. That's medicine 3.0. And of course, not everyone can afford to approach it that way, but it's the people who are on the front lines, who are the pioneers, who then are providing us with insights and information that could be helpful to more of the general population. So that's that. I just wanted to contextualize that because I think it's important.
Yeah. And I would like to mention, in regards to cost, if we think about how much did it cost, right? Like $13 billion or something for the first genome to be sequenced. And because of the demand, because companies becoming innovative and want to offer services, we can now, get genetic tests for a couple $100 or full genome sequencing for maybe like some upwards of 1,000 or something. Some tests are a bit more expensive, but I mean, I think that us talking about these topics and the demand increasing, my hope is that these types of treatments, continue to reduce in cost.
Yeah, I think we call that Moore's law. It's a really good point. And when I was in medical school and the Human Genome Project was happening at MIT next door to where I worked, um, I couldn't believe how much it cost. Like I thought that the Human Genome Project would lead to this massive revolution in healthcare, and that party really hasn't occurred, at least not in mainstream medicine. And so in many ways, it's up to people like you and me, especially advocates for women, to take some of those learnings and apply them and also help to drive the cost down, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I love that. Um, well, we'll talk about TPE a little later, but what we thought we'd do next is kind of like set the stage. So on my protocol website, I have all the tests that I do, right? Like on a quarterly basis. And you and I are going to refine those together so we can get the best tests for the audience. But I also have it listed like things I would potentially start with, right? And looking at genetics, which is, going to potentially change or guide how we treat my protocol, right? That is like a good first step.
It is. I like to start with genetics. The work that I do in precision medicine as the director of precision medicine at Thomas Jefferson University, Marcus Institute of Integrative Health. What I do is genetic testing together with biomarker testing because that's how you look at the gene environment interface.
Mm.
And the thing about genetic testing, some people are fearful of doing it. They're afraid that, it's going to be sold to marketing companies. They're afraid that it's going to be used for nefarious reasons. And I think if you only do biomarker testing without doing genomic testing, you're missing kind of half the story. You really need to do both together and then to understand which of these genes are being expressed. And one other caveat I want to make before we talk about some of your genomic testing is that pretty much everyone I've ever tested has 3 to 10 vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. Some of us have more than others. Like, from what I've seen of your genomics, mine are a bit worse than yours. And it's often the people who have more genomic vulnerability who are more sensitive, who
Mm.
often become leaders and mystics. And it sets us up to be especially interested in N-of-1 experiments.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to give that
Absolutely.
caveat because we'll talk about some of your vulnerabilities, but not with the, oh my God, Kayla, you have this, but with more of a, oh, this is so curious. Does this track with what you're experiencing? Like what's going on with your bisphenol A? Are those levels related to a genomic vulnerability? Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think, we've kind of heard these statistics. I don't know if they're 100% accurate, but they say genes are, about 10% of the equation and environment and lifestyle is 90%. So that should be, I think, really empowering because although what my genetics say can help to guide our protocol on how we might address something or maybe more detox than someone else might need, but at the end of the day, I have a lot of control over and everyone listening has a lot of control over how those genes are expressed, right?
It's a really good point. So I wrote a book called Younger about the gene environment interface and what we know. And that's the statistic that I gave, that when you look at the risk of chronic disease, which is really what ages us,
Mhm.
we know that genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. So, yes, I think the 90-10, 85-15% split is about right. When you look at other things, other outcomes, health outcomes, like athletic performance or injury risk or VO2 max capacity, we know that the numbers, the split is a little bit different. So instead of 10% genomic, 90% environment, when it comes to performance, it's more 40% genomic, 60% environment. But your point is still the same, which is that there's so much opportunity to modulate the way that your genes are talking to your body.
I love that. Well, let's get into some of my vulnerabilities and maybe some of my strengths.
Oh, for sure. I always love to start with the strengths. So, one of I read 3x4 genomic panels all day long in my patients. And so maybe, should I start with hitting a few highlights of that test for you?
Yeah, and also if there's another test, that you have a preference, I mean, definitely. I thought that one was kind of easy to read for like a general consumer, so I listed that one out on my protocol, but if you have something else, please give us your opinion.
Yeah, I think 3x4 genomics is a good place to start. It looks at about 157 different SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphism. So it's a really comprehensive and helpful place to start. It's what I run on pretty much all of my executives. When we talk about things like your detoxification ability, like especially being in the LA fires and some of the exposures that you've had, that's where you want to get more specific. And so that's where I think like the Vibrant Toxigenomics panel or um, there's other labs that run more detailed detoxification panels that can also be helpful. But when we look just at your 3x4, and I think I've got it here somewhere on my laptop. So, do you want to contextualize your 3x4 for a moment? Like, you did this test in 2023. What were you looking for? Any particular things that stood out to you? And then I'll kind of dive into the positives first and then some of the vulnerabilities.
A little bit of context. So I've actually done probably 6 or 7 different genetic tests. I sent you the 3 by 4, but I've been looking at different, I suppose, nuance between them. And, yeah, ended up landing on 3 by 4 because I thought it was pretty simple to read, but also always wanting to for one thing I do remember about my husband's is that he has compromised detox pathways. So that kind of led his medical team to recommend more, glutathione and these different types of antioxidants and detox. So we were kind of comparing mine versus his. And yeah, I'm excited to get into what some of my, potential vulnerabilities are genetically.
That's great. Yeah, so I love 3x4. It gives you pathway based results. And I think that's the way to look at genomics, at least at this point in history. So when you look at these different pathways, what 3x4 gives you is first your cellular pathways. What's going on in terms of inflammation, methylation, oxidative stress, and also detoxification. Detox, of course, being super important when you look at environmental exposures like the LA fires or just living in a city.
One quick question on that. I've heard that women are exposed to more environmental toxins than men on average, and that also women are a bit slower to actually detox. So this is a probably pretty important consideration for labs.
It is important. I've looked in the past at sex differences in detoxification in women, and I'd have to look at like the latest research on that, but there are some subtle differences. Definitely, there's increased exposure for women, in part because of personal care products. So we just tend to put more things on our skin. We get exposed to more phthalates and flame retardants and a lot of other potential toxins. So so there's the cellular pathways, and we'll circle back to that, especially detoxification for you, Kayla. There's the systems pathways, and that includes your your mood and behavior, your bone health, collagen and joints, your memory, um, glucose and insulin, histamine, huge topic, and hormonal balance. And I'll just say right away that your hormonal balance is excellent. So, really, really optimal hormone balance. And we can maybe dive into some of your previous hormone testing in a future episode and talk about what that means in terms of your genomics. Then there's cardiovascular health as a system, there's energy utilization, and that relates to um, your ability to store fat versus burn fat, your resting metabolic rate, as well as your risk for weight loss, resistance, and to regain weight when you lose weight. I've got a lot of problems with this particular pathway. You have fewer problems. And then there's the activity profile, and that's where I often start with my professional athletes because they have really good athletic genomics, and you do as well. You've got some risks that we'll talk about related to injury and recovery, or someone who needs longer to recover compared to others. And so this is where it's helpful to know that.
Yeah.
And we'll talk maybe about some of the things you do to help you with your recovery. And then there's the nutrigenomics. So what I love about 3x4 is that they're very focused on the particular nutrigenomics that are well proven, that are clinically validated. They're not testing for everything under the sun and giving you, an impossible list of supplements that you should take. Like, I would never recommend that. I think you have to look at nutrigenomics and then pair it with biomarker testing so that you can see where the gaps are. And so the good news here for you is that you are not salt sensitive. You don't have a risk of iron overload. You also seem to metabolize and use fatty acids really well. So that's good news. Your vitamin C is quite good. That's important because you need vitamin C to keep your progesterone in a healthy reference range. Vitamin C, we know in people who have something called late luteal phase disorder where they don't make enough progesterone, vitamin C can be helpful for that. And then you've got a moderate risk of problems with vitamin D and B12. The places where you do have increased risk in terms of nutrigenomics are with gluten, choline, which you especially see in eggs and poultry. So eating more of that is good. You've got some vulnerability with caffeine, not the highest level, but you're a slow metabolizer of caffeine, and with folate B9. So I'll pause there. How does that land with you?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it sounds accurate, and recalling that, I definitely remember the choline standing out, but, honestly, I'm incorporating eggs into my diet, so when I've done like yours talking about comparing it to the actual reality of what's going on, so when I look at something like, the, Neutrogen or the Nutri-Eval or the micronutrient, it's nice to be able to see, okay, my body might need more of this or maybe not store it as well. I'm not sure which one of those it is, but I can augment that by potentially diet or supplementation.
That's right. So that's where it's helpful to know your genomics because then, as you just described, you can work around it.
Yeah.
And then you're less vulnerable to some of the problems. So I'll give a quick example. If you're someone who's got a problem with your vitamin D receptor, and the level of your problem with your vitamin D receptor is moderate. It's not high impact, it's not very high impact. You're kind of in the middle. And so that's where you want to track your vitamin D and make sure that you're measuring it so that given that your vitamin D receptor may not work the way it does in someone who has the wild type or the normal type of vitamin D receptor, you can work around it by taking additional vitamin D. And I have that too. So I have to take 5,000 international units a day with vitamin K. What do you do for vitamin D?
I'm actually supplementing. I obviously vary it depending on my sun exposure. So when I was in LA and it wasn't as hot, now I'm in Austin, Texas area and it's super hot. So I have to be careful so I'm not going out midday. So I'm actually doing 10,000 IUs right now with the K2. And it seems to be keeping it around the 70 mark for me. But exactly what we're talking about, right? I have a little bit of a deficiency with my genetics and vitamin D. So maybe for me, I might have to take more, right? But for you or someone else that doesn't have that genetic variation, maybe they could take less. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, what I think is important with vitamin D is that you're tracking your level. So I
Mhm.
check my level. I've been stable with a level in the 70s to 80s for a long time. One of my issues is that I've got the CHEK2 mutation, so I've got a greater risk of breast cancer. So there was a study showing that vitamin D levels of 52 or higher in women is associated with a lower risk of breast cancer. It's a association study, not a causal study. But given that, I've kept my vitamin D levels above 52 for, since that data came out when I was in my 30s. So with vitamin D, mostly I take somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000 international units a day. And one important thing about vitamin D that a lot of people don't realize is that it's not a linear relationship. A lot of people
Mhm.
think, oh, if I take more vitamin D, my level will go up correspondingly, but it's actually an S shaped relationship. So you could be low, 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 and then suddenly kind of jump high. It's not linear. So it's helpful to measure it to be able to dial it in.
Yeah. A quick question. So, if you were going to a standard Western doc and you are a woman or either gender, at either sex, and your vitamin D is 30 or let's say 40, are you going to be alerted? Is that standard of care to tell that patient? Okay, no.
No, so, I work at Thomas Jefferson University, which is a conventional medical system. And so it will only be flagged if it's below the reference range. So if your level is 32 or 40, chances are a conventional physician or healthcare professional is going to say you're fine. Don't worry about it. But here, what we're talking about is the normal reference range, which in the US is for the average American. I don't want to be an average American. The average American has more than 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. So I want to be in that optimal range, not the reference range. And that's, something you talk about a lot, I talk about a lot. We're looking for what is associated with optimal function. And vitamin D has 400 jobs in the body. It's not just for your bones, it's also for helping to prevent and treat leaky gut. It's also an immunomodulator, as we talked about earlier. It's important for mood, it's important for your thyroid function, as we talked about. So we want to be looking at what's the optimal level for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've told us the optimal level that people should be striving for. What I'm just out of curiosity, what is the lowest it could be? Is it 20 before you get alerted that there's an issue with vitamin D?
So usually below 30, I always have to look at the reference range, but it's somewhere around 30 to 32 is the cutoff. And I can tell you, I take care of a lot of professional athletes, a lot of NBA players, and they routinely have low vitamin D levels. And they also have a lot of leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability because of how hard they train in the National Basketball Association. So this is a really common thing that may or may not trigger your conventional doc to say something. So this is where we have to change the conversation. We have to advocate for ourselves. So we have to understand what the optimal range is versus the normal range and intervene and have this more collaborative conversation about what we think is best.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Any other notes on my genetics test?
So for the 3x4, I mean, we can go deeper on pretty much any of these things that we're talking about. I think for our purposes, because I do want to talk about your toxic burden, the main areas of vulnerability. We talked about some of your strengths, like you have the potential to be just so good hormonally, which I think is exciting. We talked about some of the nutrigenomic risks you have. We talked about your recovery risk and also your injury risk, and I want to hear if those stand out to you. You are someone who's got some increased risk around having what's called pro-inflammatory fat. So, what is your fat mass right now? Like, when did you last do a body composition?
Yeah, it's about 19% body fat.
Yeah, so
Uh,
pretty low.
yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's fairly low. I remember looking at the genetics and it kind of like told me that I had a predisposition of being overweight. And I'm like, okay, well, that one, I'm not letting that happen, you know? So,
What I look for in my patients for women is a
mhm.
fat mass that's between about 18 and 23%. We think that's probably the optimal range. For women,
Good. I love that.
you need to have essential fat in your body. You know, the healthiest is brown fat, essential fat. You need to have healthy fat to be able to make your hormones and also for brain health. So if you drop below 18%, there's a chance that you may lose your period. You may have, what they call the female athletic triad, where you lose your period and your bones um, may notice you may have loss of bone strength and bone architecture. So what I'm looking for is a fat mass of 18 to 23%. And I'm looking for a muscle mass. Once again, I want it to be stable, maintained, maybe even increasing over time. So that's what I'm looking for in terms of body composition. The one-time shot I care less about, although it's a good start. I want to look at the timeline, like what's happening over time.
Yeah. I have to my muscle mass just so I have this bioimpedance scale. I'm getting ready to do a new DEXA as well, but I think the bioimpedance scale at home is quite helpful. So I have the withings, and this will actually break down your muscle mass in comparison to other users, which is kind of fun to see, which I'm in high across the board. And then it'll break down your fat against other users. But it looks like my muscle mass in my arms is about 85%. My torso is 92.9%, and legs are at about 76%. So um, there's some muscle there, which is great. I mean, obviously, I'm super intentional about that.
That's great. And any data on your visceral fat mass?
Yeah, so I it does do visceral fat, but it just says, like 1 or less than 1, so it's not super specific, but I am going to do some updated measurements on that, but it is within, like, the optimal range on that scale, but it's not super specific.
Yeah, so I like the bioimpedance scale to look over time. The gold standard is the DEXA test, as you mentioned. So getting a DEXA once a year or once every 6 months, if you're doing N of 1 experiments to try to increase your muscle mass or decrease your visceral fat or decrease your fat mass, it can be helpful to be able to track what's going on with the home scale, like with the withings that you mentioned. I use Renfo. So there's lots of less expensive options for doing a time series. So one other point I want to make about the body composition is that the tendency is for women over the age of 40 to lose about 5 pounds of muscle mass every decade and to gain about 5 pounds of fat every decade. And it tends to shift after 40 in what's called the musculoskeletal syndrome of perimenopause and menopause tends to shift from the subcutaneous areas like the breasts, the hips, the butt, to the abdomen. And that's something that we want to try to prevent. We want to work on
Yeah.
that. So if you're using a body weight scale, kind of the old style of just tracking your body weight, I think that is really not useful. You want to be looking at body composition. So I'm glad that you look at body composition. And when we look at your genomics from the 3x4, the issue for you is mostly that the fat that you have, even the low amount that you have at 19%, tends to be a little more inflammatory. So that's something that we want to track because some people have more fat, but it doesn't create a cocktail in the body that ages you prematurely. You have some risk there. So we want to dive deeper into that. We want to track things like your interleukin 6 and high sensitivity C-reactive protein, some of the advanced cardiometabolic markers to make sure that those are staying, below the range that we get concerned about. And then when we go to your cellular pathways, the two pathways that are high impact are inflammation and methylation. So I know this isn't a surprise to you, but how does that land?
Yeah, yeah, no, it definitely does. But the exciting thing is, I do track the um, HSCRP or high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and it's always, very low. I just got a test back 2 days ago. I just wanted to check in on that, and it was point 0.3, so, far less than one. So I know it's a predisposition that I have, and so I'm always thinking about that, right? So when it comes to food and sleep and, even exercise or recovery modalities, I'm always keeping in mind that I am prone to have a little bit more inflammation, which, we know is kind of a root cause of a lot of chronic disease, I would say.
It definitely is inflammaging.
Yeah.
So when it comes to inflammation, I like to look under the hood pretty thoroughly. I love that your high sensitivity C-reactive protein is zero point 0.3. I like to keep it less than zero point 0.5. But there's a lot of other tests that I want to be tracking with you, Kayla, like your neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, which is an inexpensive way to look at inflammatory tone. We want to look at your some of the interleukin cytokines. We know that interleukin 6 is the one that seems to matter the most in terms of longevity. Probably proven in men. I don't know that that's been proven in women. Although we know that yoga reduces interleukin 6, so there's a little workaround that you can use.
Love that.
And then there's these advanced tests that you can do to really understand the gene environment interface when it comes to your vascular health. And that's important to pay attention to in your 30s and 40s because things like Alzheimer's disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, the foundation for that is being set in your blood vessels in your 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so we want to intervene as soon as possible. And there's advanced testing that you can do, like with Quest, with Cleveland Heart Lab, with even Function Health, Boston Heart Lab, that can allow us to do something called phenotyping and see, in your case, you've got this increased genetic predisposition. I want to hear about your family for having issues with your blood pressure and also with your vascular health. So knowing that together with your risk of inflammation, we want to be able to track that pretty carefully and put it on your dashboard. Now, your dashboard is pretty big, but I would want to especially focus on vascular health and keeping your blood vessels as healthy as possible for as long as possible.
Yeah, I love that takeaway because it's showing us what we need to be really concerned about in the future, right? So we could intervene earlier. Yeah, in terms of family history, there isn't a huge history of anything super notable. By the way, my great grandmother is 96 and she's still living at home alone, which is, I think, very impressive. But my mom actually has low blood pressure, and my blood pressure tends to run a little bit on the low side, which is interesting. A couple individuals in my family, my cousin has type 1 diabetes, And then there are some individuals in my family too that have type 2 diabetes, much to my chagrin because I keep kind of trying to excite them about the idea that probably that could not be not be happening. But yeah, that's the majority of what I can recall of family history. My
Okay.
parents are still relatively young, that's also something to consider. My mom is 54 and my dad is 56 or 57, so we're not yet to see all of the issues that may manifest with them.
That's very helpful. So I love hearing about your great grandmother. I've written quite a bit in my first book, The Hormone Cure, about my great grandmother who died in her sleep at 97. And it sounds like she would have gotten along with your great grandmother because she lived alone. She practiced yoga every day. She could still stick her foot behind her head when she was in her 90s. She came to my wedding and danced like shamelessly with every man in the room. And that's a picture of longevity and probably something you inherited that is part of the reason why your genomics are so good. So I love hearing about that. But so even with low blood pressure, I think of low blood pressure sometimes as related to adrenal function and what's been happening with cortisol over the course of your life. So we still want to pay attention to your vascular health. And, another factor, we don't have a lot of time to go deep on your total toxic burden today, but one of the factors that I want to bring in here is that your bisphenol A levels were elevated when you tested in January, and they were still elevated when you tested in February. And I want to make a couple of comments about that because it relates to what we've talked about with your 3x4. And then we can talk maybe in the next podcast more about your toxigenomics, which
Yeah.
tells a more complete story than the 3x4. But the thing about your bisphenol A is that it can be toxic to the immune system. It's a multiple endocrine disruptor, so it can disrupt not just estrogen levels, but thyroid levels and androgen levels. It's usually, you get exposed through plastic water bottles, plastic food containers. So I know you're really careful about toxic exposure, but there's another factor that relates to your 3x4. We know that methylation is an issue for you. That's basically how part of the way that you turn on and off genes in your body. And bisphenol A, when levels are in the red zone, like they are for you, can decrease methylation. So we want to pay attention to that. We want to track your methylation. The good news is there's a lot that you can do to address it. So we know that BPA, the way that it's biochemically treated in the body is through a process called glucuronidation. And so you can take a supplement called calcium D-glucarate to increase the excretion of bisphenol A. There's also a gene called BCM01 that I want to check in you. So we can check that in a Vibrant NutriPro. There's also some other genetic tests where we can look at it.
Okay.
And then we know that you need vitamin A to be able to get rid of bisphenol A. So I know you had a micronutrient test. Do you remember what your vitamin A level was? You don't need a high level, but you need about 5,000 international units a day.
I don't remember the exact number, but I do know that everything on my most recent micronutrient panel was within, their optimal zone. There were some numbers that were on a little bit of the lower side of the optimal, which I like to kind of be right in the middle. Um, so I think that one was okay. But yeah, I mean, it's just for a little bit of context around the BPA testing too and the total toxic burden. So I had a test, let's see, in September of 2024, and the BPA was 1.8, which is quite low within an okay range. And then during the fires, I retested. So I tested on 118. It jumped up to 11.77. So LA had all these fires. There were obviously a ton of different plastics burning, smart homes, batteries, cars, a variety of different, contaminants in the air. And I really tried so hard. You know, when you come over, hopefully soon, you'll see that in all the rooms, I have these air testers. So it's actually measuring the VOCs, a Jasper in every single room. So I tried really hard, but did still go outside. I did still go to the gym. I did still operate as a normal human being. So yeah, it jumped to 11.77. That was in January. And then I did the therapeutic plasma exchange. And then it went down 1 month later in February to 7.88. And then I'm about to retest again. So I'm excited to see what happens with it. But no, I mean, I was so concerned when I got these labs back from fire times. I mean, it was just unlike anything I've ever seen. But also, it's relevant because I think a lot of individuals may have exposures, and so us having this conversation about how to detox from things like that is just so important. Because yeah, I try so hard to avoid BPA in everything from even clothing to containers to the air to no tap water, microplastic-free salt. I mean, I really am going the long haul here, but, yeah, so that's some context.
That's very helpful. And, my levels are also elevated. So I think we should do a podcast where we really focus on your total toxic burden and what happened with the fires because you've got such a great time series to tell the story. Did you ever try calcium glucarate as a way of addressing bisphenol A?
I actually did try a little bit, in the past. I read some literature on this too, so I can't wait to see. So the protocol, and we'll dive deeper into it, but, I did the, obviously cruciferous veg, sauna, did the TPE, also tried something well, I'll bench that RX that I told you, that I was taking. We can talk about that more later, but I'm really excited to see the difference in the new total toxic burden. I'm really hopeful that all this stuff made a big difference because having high levels of toxins and BPA in particular is just so concerning to me, you know?
It's concerning and I like to talk about these way in a way that doesn't fearmonger. I think it's
Yeah.
important for us to not scare everyone because um you read the headline on the microplastics now. Glass water bottles are also a problem, and you just feel like, well, I might as well just drink out of a plastic bottle because now glass bottles are a problem too. And that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, um, I would say we think the caps might be part of the exposure from the study from France that just got published. So, still drinking from glass containers, maybe not commercial glass containers, but a glass. I think you're drinking from a glass, maybe with some reverse osmosis water. So, we're going to watch you take a sip here as you hydrate so beautifully.
I'm back old school, I guess.
Yeah. And I just want to make a note that Uh, Kayla has done some testing of microplastics. We're still in the very early stages of having a commercially available test. I know Brian Johnston has one, and there's one that you've run. We think that bisphenol A can also be kind of a proxy or a substitute for how much microplastic exposure you've had. So that's the
Mhm.
context in which I wanted to talk about bisphenol A. And, and then we'll dive in deeper. Another thing that really helps with bisphenol A is cod liver oil. Is that something that you take?
I'm right now doing the Omegagenics by Metagenics, the 2400, but if you recommend it, happy to switch to a cod liver oil.
I would maybe add it to the Omegagenics. I think the Omegagenics is a really good product, and we know with your vascular risk and your inflammation risk, you need what we think of as balanced omegas. So not just omega 3s, but I would say the cod liver oil is another way to get some of these other nutrients that can help you with excreting BPA.
Good. Do you like, I know it's kind of basic, but just like increasing cruciferous vegetables for anyone that's listening?
I do. I think that's a really helpful strategy. And maybe in a future podcast, we can talk about the specifics of what that does. I think of it mostly for estrogen metabolism, but it certainly helps with, um, let's see if I can get this right off the top of my head, aryl hydrocarbons. I think it helps with that as well. Um, my strategy always is food first. I always think that we want to leverage food for all that it can do to help us with detoxification pathways, especially for those of us who have more sluggish pathways. So food first, supplements second is how I approach it.
Well, this has been so fun. Obviously, we're going to have future podcasts, many of them, so we can go deeper into a lot of these topics because there's just so much to unpack here and so many exciting things to discuss in regards to women's health. So I am so excited we're doing this.
Me too. I feel like we got off to a good start. We wanted to talk about 700 things today, and we tried to confine ourselves to like 24. So hopefully that's not too overwhelming.
Yeah, well, this has been amazing. And yeah, we'll include some information in our show notes and stay tuned for our next one. And you can also find this podcast on Dr. Sarah's podcast, Treated, that I have been so excited to be a guest on, but you've also had incredible other guests. So definitely would recommend tuning into that as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kayla. Good to be with you.
Same. Podcast is for informational purposes only, and views expressed on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Kayla Barnes, does not accept responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of the information contained herein. Opinions of their guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.